Hey there, welcome to Burnout to Thriving, the podcast where we toss perfection out the window and embrace the beautiful chaos of being a woman in a patriarchal world. I'm Cecilia Mannella, your therapist and coach, who's here to help you go from burnt out, stressed, and overwhelmed to empowered and thriving, all without pretending life isn't messy. Each week, we'll chat about the ups, the downs, the real moments of redefining success on your own terms. This is your permission slip to ditch the pressure of perfection. So grab your favorite drink, coffee, tea, water, or maybe a little bit of wine, and join me for honest conversations about what it really means to thrive in this real messy world. Are you ready? Let's do it. Have you ever noticed that being a leader will trigger some childhood stuff for you? I want you to know this is super normal. And in fact, I want to spend today's episode talking about how being in leadership positions can bring out some old dynamics potentially or old challenges that kind of have roots in your childhood. If you're joining me for the first time today, thank you for tuning in to Burnout to Thriving. And I'm your host, Cecilia Mannella, and I am a therapist and business and leadership coach. And I've been spending most of my time focusing on helping leaders build sustainability in themselves and in their teams, and also coaching business owners, service-based business owners, on how to have a sustainable business that helps them create the life that they want. I had an interesting conversation recently in one of my coaching sessions around leadership. I talk a lot about leadership in coaching, and what came up in particular was the challenges when leadership triggers or brings up things from our childhood. And some of those things being people pleasing or avoiding conflict or feeling guilt with setting boundaries. So there's some of these old things that actually can show up in leadership. And I want you to know that all that stuff is actually really normal. And in fact, it'd be really weird if you have been in leadership for a while and none of that stuff has actually surfaced. That would be strange to me. And it might be an indication that you are not showing up authentically in your leadership, or you're not being as vulnerable as you probably need to be. That in some ways you're a little bit guarded. So expect that leadership is going to bring up some old family stuff. And I want to normalize that and have a bit of a discussion as why that happens and then what to do about it. Leadership is such an interesting thing. So this is whether you're leading a team of two, or you are an executive or a director, CEO, manager, but also it comes down to business ownership and entrepreneurship. All of these roles are all about leadership. And in fact, even parenting is about leadership. So this role of being a leader is a privileged role in many ways, and it's an honor role, but it also comes with a lot of responsibility. And it's kind of this wild ride, actually, and to be a leader. And if you've been a leader for a while, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because every single day is different and the problems are different. And as the company grows, your business grows, or the organization you're with grows, it brings up different problems in leadership than you had at the beginning. So it's not about the size of your organization or your business. It's not about the size of your team. It really is about the core tenets of leadership. And in building trust in a relationship, which is a leadership must, is building trust. And in order to build trust with anybody, not just in a team or leading a company or a business, but leadership in general is about trust. And in order to build trust, there has to be a level of vulnerability. There's no way around it. And if you haven't accepted that yet, I'm really sorry to break the news to you. But vulnerability is absolutely required to build trust. If you think about how people build trust with you, what makes someone trustworthy? And if you were to really think about it, I'm sure that one of your top 3 answers around what makes someone else trustworthy is the fact that there's a sense of vulnerability. Because in vulnerability, we get to know that person. We see parts of them that are relatable. We see a bit of that messy. and it connects with our own messiness. We don't want perfection. And in fact, perfection doesn't actually build trust, it actually builds distrust. So it does the opposite. So sometimes when we're like really encroached in perfectionism and we think that that is the way forward, especially in leadership, or that people expect you to be perfect, that's actually not true, because perfection actually takes away from trust. So I want you to lean into the messiness of who you are and the vulnerability of that, because that's what actually builds trust in your team. It builds trust with people around you, and it's what they see in you that makes them want to follow you. Essentially, that's what a leader does is, paves the way for others to find success. And in order for that trust to be there, there needs to be a sense of vulnerability. Now, with vulnerability, it's a complex topic, and there are so many people that have written so many things about it. Dr. Brene Brown being the pioneer of that space. And it relates to leadership because if we aren't showing up vulnerably, then we're not being brave. And then we can't expect other people to do what we're not doing. We can't expect those that we lead to be brave if we are not being brave ourselves. And I think that's a really important thing to realize, that you can only take your team as far as you've taken yourself, especially in personal development or what you're willing to do. So when we show up in this honest, authentic, kind of vulnerable way with our teams, sometimes we're surprised by how much of our childhood stuff shows up. And there's a lot of mimicking of teams and leadership to family dynamics. Now, I don't want you to think of your team as your family, because that's not true. There's definitely an exchange of expectations, there's wages, there's all these things that kind of muddy the waters and doesn't make it a family. So if you are a leader that is saying we're like family, you're not like family. Um, because there's just the dynamics are different. You can have a healthy team that has a really collaborative and connected relationships, and that's fantastic, but you are not a family. However, the dynamics of leadership and being on a team will also bring up family dynamic stuff from your childhood, because our first original team we've ever been on is our family, where there is leadership, or there's expected to have leadership, and people follow, and there's growth and development, and you are a little group, a little team. And that's really what a family is a connecting between humans. We see the messiness of people, we see the imperfections, and essentially we're functioning like a team. So of course, when you take up on leadership of a team, it's going to bring up some of your family stuff. So, in a most recent coaching session with a small business owner, a service based business owner, there was we've had some lots of conversations around values and expectations, and how to hold the team members accountable for their roles on in the business. And there was a little bit of conflict between the owner of the business, the person that I coach, and one of the team members. And that relationship was going to come to an end, and both mutually agreed upon, for different value sets and in different visions of where things were going, which is uncomfortable, but that's to be expected in a position of leadership, and especially in entrepreneurship, is that not everyone who was with you at the beginning is going to be with you through the middle or through the end. And that's accepted. What was interesting was, despite her having very clear boundaries and very clear expectations around what was expected, and that the relationship was going to dissolve and the team member was going to move on to other endeavors, guilt suddenly showed up. Even though we had gone through the entire process and everything was ethical and everything was in line with values and had integrity, and the communication was overly clear, boundaries are clear, expectations are clear. So if we looked at it on a piece of paper, if I were to, pull 100 people, 99% of them would say this is a really great plan. It's really clear. It sets really clear boundaries and expectations, and the everything is collaborative and everything's on point. So on paper, it looks fantastic. The execution of it goes well. Is it perfect? No, because nothing is perfect. Things are messy, but we aim to do the best that we can. So it was really great. And the ricochet was guilt. And in further exploration with her, it was this guilt had a really long history. And the origins of this guilt goes back to childhood. And what she shared was that she grew up in a family that where the women, especially in the family, responded to everything with guilt. So, whenever there was conflict, the response was guilt. Whenever there was any kind of conversation, there was guilt. Even if there was rewards, if I did a good job, if I succeeded, if I got an A in a class, there was guilt associated with it. So, there is this long history and narrative of guilt being the response to anything in life. And she was quite surprised that it showed up in this space. And we had a very lengthy coaching session about it, around really exploring what does guilt actually tell you, and what are the expectations of guilt, and what purpose might it serve or not serve. And she was able to come to a place to realize that this was a very expired response, in the sense that had nothing to do with the situation. And that if we looked at the situation very objectively and again mapped it on paper, there really is no space for guilt, because guilt is about doing something wrong. Okay, so it's about doing something bad or doing something wrong. And none of that was part of the plan. The plan was very clear. So if the plan is clear and objectively you can look at it and know that it's the right thing to do and you're doing with compassion and kindness, but guilt shows up, then that tells you that that is an old thing. That is not a current thing. That has roots in something from your past. If you pull the thread of it, it'll follow its way down probably to your childhood. So, in exploring some childhood things that come up in leadership, it was really great to see that leadership really does trigger our childhood vulnerabilities, because we are exposed. And being a leader is a vulnerable position. And there are expectations that come with that and responsibilities. And so the idea of perfection shows up. And I would be surprised at anyone who's listening to this, who's a leader, a business owner, entrepreneur, a director, or any kind of leadership position, even in parenting, where perfection doesn't permeate as an expectation. And whenever perfection shows up as an expectation, whatever your childhood response to perfection is going to show up, whether that's guilt, whether that's people pleasing, whether that's anger and frustration, shutting down, emotionally pulling away, overachievement, overcompensating, over accommodating, whatever it is going to show up. Because in leadership, you are exposed. You are vulnerable, in the same way that when we're in families and we're little humans, and little humans are very vulnerable to the dynamics of their family that they're born into. They don't have a lot of power, they don't have a lot of authority, and they rely on somebody else to be the leader. And even in adulthood, when you are the leader, you would think that you wouldn't be triggered by this, but in fact you are, because you're having human relationships. And we learn from our families, from our childhood, how to have family relationships. And a personal example of that is I'm the firstborn of 4 children to 2 immigrant parents. So the pressure to perform was high, and not performance for the performance sake, but more about, doing the best that I possibly can, because my parents sacrificed so much for me to be living in this country and to have all the opportunity possible. So the messaging wasn't necessarily be perfect, but it was be really, really good. And I internalized that as perfection. And what I internalized that as well was to not be vulnerable. That showing vulnerability was actually a weakness, and that my job or what was expected of me was to perform and to overperform, overachieve, be really good at pretty much everything I tried. And it created a little bit of a disconnect in vulnerability for me. So when I stepped into a position of leadership in my mid 20s or late 20s, it was really hard for me to be vulnerable. And in fact, I found myself being hardened by the fact I was being a leader. I felt the burden of responsibilities with working in a nonprofit and the expectations around how much services we could provide with as little funding as possible. And I found myself getting hardened. And then when I stepped into my own entrepreneurship journey, it was hard for me to be vulnerable. And in fact, I doubled down on this idea of being really stoic and emotionally removed and trying to logic everything and to not show my vulnerability. And that didn't work for me. And when I realized that I was hyper performing my childhood expectations, and that I didn't have any parents expecting this for me anymore. And in fact, that I could redefine how I wanted to show up, how I wanted leadership to look like, and especially how I wanted success to look like. I was able to step into a different place with my business, with my leadership, with the roles I was in, and create more of a sustainable approach, which has more trust factor in it and it has a way more vulnerability in it. And in that, I realized that people pleasing was a bit of a challenge, and I had to really address that. So, in working in leadership, I want you to think about what what does it trigger in me? And what does it bring up for me being in leadership? What childhood experiences or messages that am I carrying that gets really activated with being in leadership? And most of the time, it gets activated in conflict. So either conflict with someone you are leading, or conflict with a customer or a client, or conflict between goals and values, potentially like not meeting financial markers or not meeting revenue goals or achievement goals or whatever the goals are. There can be some conflict in not reaching that. And in that, you're going to find yourself activated in a very specific way. And that way is going to have roots in childhood. There's no way around it. Now, what do we do about it? And this is where the stuff gets, I'm never going to leave you without a plan on what to do and how to engage with this in a very different manner. So then the first thing to do is actually become aware of it. You cannot change what you don't know about yourself. It's really simple and yet complex. And until you acknowledge what it is that's being activated, you cannot change it. And so a lot of things out there are just behavior modification focused around like change your morning routine and make sure you get so many grams of protein and make sure you move your body. And now all those things are fantastic and absolutely necessary. But none of those things are really going to address what is being activated in you that comes from your childhood. So you need to become aware. And the quickest way to become aware is to journal and to write and to map it out. You can even, draw pictures. It doesn't even matter what you do on a piece of paper, but it is pen to paper around what is being activated in me and what does it remind me of. So in those situations where you are giving feedback to somebody or receiving feedback or have a hard decision to make or are just in the entrepreneurial, messy journey that it is, I want you to grab a notebook and I want you to write a little bit of what you're feeling and what you're thinking and the beliefs that are at play. What do you believe about yourself in these moments? What are you engaging in? And in that, when you have those responses, I want you to ask yourself, what does this remind me of? Or how far back does this go? Where was this born? What was the timeline? What's the timeline of this thing being born? Like, what's the timeline of guilt being born in my life? What's the timeline of people pleasing being born in my life? Because you weren't born with it. So at some point, it was born into your life. It was given into your life. It was something that grew, that was gifted to you and then grown along the way. So the first thing is about becoming aware. You cannot change what you're not aware of. You cannot change anything about yourself that you do not have awareness about. And you cannot change what you don't understand about yourself. So the journaling is about awareness and about understanding. So I want you to write about what you notice of what's activated, what that story is, how far back it goes. And I want you to spend more time writing about that time, about the dynamics in your family, about the dynamics of how this was gifted to you and what is at play. Is it is there trauma there? Is there sexism? Is there expectations different for different genders? Is there racism? Is there classism? Like, what else is at play here that has reinforced this activation story that you have? And that's really like the biggest step. Once you know that, you can bring that into your leadership. And so that's step number 2, is bringing in that awareness into your leadership and asking yourself, how can you hold two things at the same time? Because we try to simplify answers and think it's one or the other. But the truth is that we can hold two things at the same time. I can be confident on one hand and still hold guilt at the same time. I don't have to give in to guilt or make any decisions through guilt or allow guilt to, you know, have this much power, but it can still be there even though I'm confident in the decisions I've made. So two things can exist at the same time. I can have boundaries and feel the need to people please or feel the pull to people please. And I can feel that pull, but it doesn't mean I have to give into it. It doesn't mean I have to give it power. I just have to be aware of it. So the second step really is about noticing that this is already existing in your leadership and you need to hold two things at the same time. So you've got your values as a leader on one side, and then you've got the activation into your child stuff on the other side. And I need you to just hold these two things and become really aware that these two things exist at the exact same time. And it's sometimes easier said than done. This like takes a lot of intention, it takes a lot of focus, and it takes a lot of vulnerability from you to recognize these things about yourself and to know that you are just way more complex than you give yourself credit for. The third thing I want you to do is I want you to consciously choose your leadership values. And what that means is integrity is a very high leadership value of mine. And I can get pulled into over accommodation and people pleasing. And in holding these two, I have a choice, and you have a choice. I can choose people pleasing or I can choose integrity. And how I choose integrity is about stepping closer to it. So it is being clear with my boundaries. It's being radically honest. It's being very attuned to what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. It's keeping my company's values and goals and vision right on hand. That I'm not going to give those away in order to people please or to be overly accommodating to somebody else. And in doing that and choosing the values and in intentionally stepping towards that, I will then communicate that with my team or who I'm having a conversation with. So I want you to radically shift into choosing your leadership values and then communicating that to say, well, this is the value that's really important to me in my leadership, and this is what I'm going to choose. I'm leaning towards this. And the more that we vocalize something, the more powerful it becomes. The words we choose radically influence our lives. Words are the most powerful thing in our arsenal, is the words that we use to describe our experiences, the words that we use to describe our vision, our goals, but also the words that we use to describe our reality. So there's purpose in choosing these values, choosing your leadership values, and intentionally stepping in that direction. So it's not so much about getting rid of the childhood stuff, because that's actually really hard to do. It's more about intentionally choosing the values you want to live into, because that's where your power is. And although it's not always easy, it is 1,000 times worth it. And in my coaching session, to kind of bring it full circle back, and we had this discussion about guilt and the roots of guilt and what it tells her and how it's limiting her leadership capacity and ability and sustainability. She had the realization that guilt had the power to take away her sustainable life. And her sustainable life is a good balance between how much she works and how much time she has for her family. And she has this beautiful balance for her right now in her life, and that she needs for her and her family. And guilt has the potential to wreck that, to take that away from her. And when we were able to map it out, she came to a really strong place of deciding that she wasn't going to let guilt take away her sustainable life and her sustainable business. And when you can root into something like that, it makes it a lot easier to do leadership and to do hard things and make hard decisions and have hard conversations. It might be a little bit uncomfortable because you're rooting into the values of what's actually important. And this is why this kind of work is so important as leaders, is to recognize where it comes from, recognize the narrative of its roots and the power that it's had, recognize the conflict and that you can hold two things at the same time, even though they're completely opposing, because you are an amazing human being and you can do this. And we all do. We all hold opposing feelings, thoughts, beliefs all the time. And then intentionally choosing your leadership values, focusing on what you want to grow versus focusing on what you want to get rid of. It's so much easier to focus on what you want to grow. The what you want to get rid of will slowly shrink over time, the more you focus on what you actually want to grow. And the best thing to hold on to what you want to grow are your leadership values, your business values, your entrepreneurship values, because that is exciting and there's a lot of energy in there. And so I want you to focus on those values and try to grow that while while at the same time know that you're holding this other thing. You're just not giving it a whole bunch of attention. And it's okay that it's there. It doesn't have to go away. It's just going to shrink a little bit over time, the more you focus on what you actually want to grow. So here's to being a good leader, a good enough leader, not a perfect leader, but a good enough leader. And half the battle is fought with awareness and self-reflection and a willingness to do something different. I hope you found today's episode helpful. And if you know someone who actually needs to hear this, please share it with them. I appreciate your time, attention, and energy in tuning in today, and welcome any feedback. Send me an email, hit reply, leave a comment. I would love to hear your insights into your own leadership growth and what you find challenging, so I can give you a little bit of tips and tricks and help you along the way. Until next time, be bold.